So welcome everybody to the 6th Roses seminar, Reading Online Sport Economics Seminar. It's a pleasure, it's a delight to have with us this week Dennis Coates of the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, presenting his work on salary distributions and team performance in Major League Soccer. Before we do that though, this today would have been many of us taking part, certainly Dennis, Brad, Bernd, and a number of other people would have been in Gijón in northern Spain, which is the reason for this slightly different background that I've got this week. That's a picture taken from the tower at the conference venue. It's a conference that would have been its 15th run this year. It's a conference in which many of us met, reconnected for the first time. Many productive collaborations formed, many great times had of the event. Just a quick heads up: if you can have your microphones on mute when you're not speaking, that'll be really helpful in terms of feedback. But back to what I was talking about. This would have been in a non-COVID parallel universe. We would have been meeting many of us in Gijón instead, and this would have been the 15th year. So it felt like a good point to perhaps mark how this conference has run, and how it's been informative over the years. I was quite pleased in the week to be able to pull together some photos. A number of different people have contributed photos on Twitter. And so what you can see here, I'll try and turn it into a slideshow. I'm assuming everyone can see this, otherwise if anyone can't, shout loudly if anyone's got their microphones on. But this is a picture from 2006, I believe, the first conference. And these are pictures. These are going to automatically skip on. Often the conference ends with a match at Sporting Gijón. Stefan Kassen, Brad Humphreys there. And then this is the conference itself with John Goddard presenting, Placido in the background there introducing, British heavyweights of sports economics and economics more generally there. And what we've had over these years is an incredibly enriching set of conferences. And so it felt appropriate to try and mark that today and say a little something about that. This is going to tick on one of the attractions of the conference, as well as the high quality academic content, is the scenery nearby and the food as well, and the drink as well. All sorts of things that come together to make this a really fantastic event that's marked the calendar, certainly for me and for many others, for many years. In 2018, Brad Humphreys of the North American Association of Sports Economists presented the association's award for professional service, the Larry Hadley Award. And so what I want to do now, assuming I can control my own computer, is drag us away from what is undoubtedly, if I do speak for myself, a fantastic set of photos and memories from the conference. And I'm going to hand over to Brad to say a few things himself about the award that Placido was given back in 2018.
Thanks, James, and greetings everybody from lockdown in cold, dreary West Virginia. I'm glad to be here for the 6th week, and I want to with everybody, and I want to thank James for organizing this. I think it's been tremendous for keeping us all sort of connected in this very difficult time. It's, I think, impossible to fully understand the effect that Placido Rodriguez has had on sports economics research and what he's done for us with this conference. I've met many people. I've seen great research. I've been able to network in great ways, and it's been personally very fulfilling for me to participate in it. And I know that all the other people who have been to the conference over these years feel the same way. And I think we all owe a great debt of gratitude to Placido for the tireless work that he's done in organizing that conference and making it happen. And for that reason, the North American Association of Sports Economists we only give one award, and it's a service award for service to sports economics research. And we gave that to Placido as James said, 2 years ago, last summer, 2 summers ago.
I think it was 2 years ago.
And, you know, it turns out that Plácido knew Larry Hadley, the person who the award is named for, and he found it very moving to receive that award. But I think it was richly deserved, and I urge all of you, if you ever have the opportunity, to thank Plácido personally for what he's done for all of us. That's all I've got, James.
That's great. Thank you, Brad. And yeah, I mean, one of the things that I think we'll be able to do down the line, we can already take a stock take already, is count up the number of economics papers and sports economics papers that have been a direct result of collaborations and discussions formed at that conference. And with that in mind, it's great to turn our minds to some present research, sports economics and economics more broadly, presented by Dennis. I will man the chat function today. Any kind of clarification questions, I'll try and address them best I can. But we'll let Dennis speak through his talk, and then there'll be a Q&A session at the end where you can ask questions either in the chat function or in the by unmuting yourself. If you can stay muted for the duration of the talk, that will be really helpful in terms of avoiding feedback and things. So over to you, Dennis, for your talk.
Great, thanks, James. Let's see here. Are you getting my slideshow now?
Yep, we can see that.
Okay, great. So this is a paper that maybe is a little bit misleading by the title that you were given in the Roses program. It is going to be about Major League Soccer, and it is going to be about wage dispersion, but it's a little bit different take on the issue of wage dispersion from what maybe you've seen in the past. This is joint work with 2 of my colleagues from Perm in Russia, Anna Bykova and Petr Parshakov. I think both of them are here, and apologies to Petr for spelling his name the English way as opposed to the Russian way. I hope he will forgive me for that. This work actually has been set aside for a really long time because I first presented a draft of this paper at the Football Economics Conference held simultaneously with the World Cup in Moscow. So I presented the paper, put it aside, and decided about well, I guess when James asked if anybody wanted to present a paper, that I would present this paper that we had been working on for all that time, or not working on, as the case may be. So it's been around for a little while, but we've updated data, and that has been an interesting process in itself. I'll say a little bit about that shortly. The basic idea here is we have the team production model, and probably everybody here has heard about team production. Got different theories about what pay compression does within the team. And so you have Lazier saying that pay compression, meaning that within the group, the more similar everybody's pay is, that you're going to have a more efficient process. But then on the other side, you have Lazier and Rosen coming from it, at it from the tournament theory side, and they're saying basically, just as in tournament theory, if you have a really large distribution of pay, potential prizes, that gives much more motivation for people to work very, very hard to win the really big prize. So in that case, we would have greater dispersion is going to raise effort and raise productivity. Then you have Levine come along. He's got what's been called cohesion theory, and basically it's similar to Lazier's idea about the lack of the lack of dispersion, or small band of salary distribution, and that builds teamwork and therefore productivity. It's not really the same sort of story as Lazier. It's more of a psychological theory, maybe think of it that way. But the idea here is smaller dispersion in salary, more similar pay across all of the people on the team is going to be or lead to better teamwork and more productivity. And then there's Ramaswamy and Rawthorne from an Economica paper in 1991. And they say that what you're going to have to do is give really high pay to those people, those workers who have the greatest potential for sabotage. So those people who are most able to put a kink in the entire production process have to get paid the most. So this is sort of the context, beginning context from which we are going to build. That's all theoretical. There is a variety of empirical papers that have looked at this, and I'm going to talk about them, just give you a basic idea about different thoughts about how this might work. So there's a social psychology framework, there's human resources framework, and there's sort of a talent management framework. They all have sort of a slightly different theoretical take on what might be happening, what might cause certain results. But they all are focused on the performance of the team and the dispersion of pay within that team. At the same time, in labor economics, what we see is that a great deal of wage variation between 30 and 50% comes about because of individual or personal effects. So if you think about estimating a wage equation with observations over time, so you have a panel of wages, that what you're going to get is those individual fixed effects may be very big. They're explaining large portions of the variation in wages. In the sporting context, probably the first empirical paper to deal with anything like this is Ehrenberg and Bognano, where they're specifically testing tournament theory. And they use golf data. The whole thing is really about what individual agents will do when faced with very steep set of prize place relationships. So really huge prize for first, substantially smaller for second, substantially smaller for third, but not quite as big a drop off from second to third as from first to second, and so on. But it's all about what the individual agents are going to do. So it's not really about team production. There's a lot of papers in this genre thinking about performance in tennis tournaments, in individual, other kinds of individual sports like cross country or marathoning or any kind of running, where it's an individual competition. People have studied this kind of issue. On the team side of it, there's also a large literature. So I'm going to talk more about these because these are really more relevant. So maybe the first one to do this is Richards and Guel in 1998. They look at Major League Baseball. And what I've got here is that the mean salary and the variance in the salary. So the mean salary has a positive and statistically significant effect in that study, but the variance in salary has a negative point estimate, but it's not statistically significant. So the question mark in parentheses indicates that it's not a statistically significant result. The sign is the point estimate. The question mark indicates not statistically significant. Summers looked at the NHL, used the salary, found a positive effect, the Gini coefficient negative but not significant. Bloom, he used Major League Baseball, looked at average pay, got a negative effect, but that wasn't significant. And the Gini was significant and negative. And one of the things that I want you to see here, and that I'm showing you this for, is the basic idea that total salary is a relevant variable is coming through. And I think everybody listening to this would probably agree that the total payroll of a club ought to be some measure, for example, of the quality of that club, particularly payroll relative to the other teams in the league. The other thing I want you to notice is that there's no consistent measure of the dispersion of the salary. So one case, it's the variance. Two cases so far, it's been the Gini coefficient. Craig Debkin used the Herfindahl index. And so we're getting different approaches to measuring that variability, and we're getting also different findings. DeBrock, Hendricks, and Conker in 2004, also Major League Baseball, positive effect of salary, negative effect of salary dispersion. So if you look at that, you say, well, there's a whole bunch of Americans doing a bunch of stuff on that crazy baseball game, and then one person doing hockey, and you're probably not going to go far wrong. Except for Bernd Frick and Joachim Prince and Katrine Winkleman, who decided we're going to do all the major sports in the U.S. And so they've got Major League Baseball, the National Football League, National Hockey League, and Major League Baseball, and the NBA. Unfortunately, they get different results for each of those leagues. So in the NBA, the Gini coefficient is positive and significant. In the NHL, it's positive as a point estimate, but not significant. In the NFL, it's negative, but not significant. And in Major League Baseball, it's negative and significant. So we're getting different results based on different sports with different institutions, different salary structures. And so we don't have really a clear test of what the relationship is between salary distribution and performance of the clubs. Then in 2011, Egon Frank and Stefan Neusch published a paper which must have sat around for a long time, because the working paper version that I had said forthcoming in applied economics in 2008, and it didn't come out in print until 2011. So must have sat at that journal for a long time. I think, though I'm happy to be corrected on this, that they are probably the first to study football, particularly with respect to salary dispersion, not for pay for performance. There's several studies of that, but I think they're the first that actually looked at the distribution of pay as an influence on team output. Unfortunately, like everything that has to do with football, you got to use a salary proxy, basically, if you're going to study the sport in Europe. There aren't enough salaries, actual salaries and contracts published to know, and the salary proxies they used were estimates from Kicker magazine. They also proposed that there's a nonlinear relationship between salary distribution and performance. So if you think about the theory that said, well, if you have a compressed salary, that could be good for building cohesion, for building teamwork. But if you have a widely dispersed salary, that could lead to problems of sabotage. It could lead to problems of jealousy or ruining sort of the team cohesion, or there could be these sort of tournament theory kinds of effects like Lazier and Rosen suggested. And so with the nonlinear relationship, you can actually test if at some levels of distribution, the effect of more compression is raising performance, and at other levels of dispersion, it's harming. So that was, I think, a very important step forward. And the one thing that I'll note here is this is the first study that I saw that included a measure of talent dispersion. Now that's important because that's really going to be the focus of what we do here, is thinking about talent dispersion as well as salary dispersion. Now there's existing studies that of the relationship that include some measure of ability, but typically the measure of ability is just the team wage bill. So you have a higher team wage bill relative to the other teams in the league, and that means that you've got more talent on your team. You might have things like, are there national team players on the team? Are there how much experience does the coach have, and things of that sort as kind of measures of ability, but generally speaking, not very much of that. And dispersion in player abilities is very, very unusual. There's the Franken-Neusch paper that I mentioned before, and then two other papers that I found. Actually, one is a PhD dissertation by Jonathan Brown at Temple University. But Pabst and Bryson and Gomez use the coefficient of variation. They use the coefficient of variation for the ERA, earned run average of pitchers in baseball, and on base plus slugging percentage of the non-pitchers in baseball as their measures of talent dispersion. Brown uses wins above replacement player of the top 15 players on the team, and he uses the Herfindahl-Hirschman index. So again, very different kinds of approaches, coefficient of variation, Herfindahl-Hirschman index, and then the talent heterogeneity of Franken-Neusch is the standard deviation of the average match evaluations. So players on a team are evaluated by Kicker Magazine at the end of every game, and then what he's got is the standard deviation of those evaluations, or what they have as their measure of dispersion. So why might this be a problem? First, salary dispersion could simply be a proxy for talent dispersion, in which case the findings that salary dispersion is harmful could really just mean that talent dispersion is harmful. And talent dispersion and salary dispersion, on the other hand, could have completely or somewhat separate impacts, but they're certainly going to be correlated. And if they are correlated and you omit one, then you're potentially biasing the results on the other. And so what we have here as a hypothesis is simply that the salary distribution metrics, like the Herfindahl-Hirschman index, the coefficient of variation, the Gini coefficient, or what have you, tile index, which some people have used, they reflect, at least in part, and maybe entirely, the dispersion in ability. So what's the plan here? First, the plan is to bore you to tears. Well, maybe I've already succeeded there. So now we're going to move on to the second step in the plan, which is to construct individual productivity and its dispersion. That'll be the second thing we do. Then I'm going to estimate team output without productivity dispersion, but with salary dispersion. Then I'll do the opposite. So I'll estimate team output with with productivity dispersion, but not salary dispersion. Then I'll do it with both. I'll summarize what we found, and then I'll talk about our future plans. Okay, so here's sort of the model that we're going to test. Some measure of performance, and our performance here is going to be the log of the points per game. And you might say, why points per game? And the answer is because in our data, Major League Soccer, the number of games in a season has changed over time. And so we couldn't just do the log of points, because we would potentially be biasing things for those seasons, or relative to those seasons, with fewer points relative to more points. We're going to include measures of salary distribution. And when I say salary distribution there, what I mean is both the level of salary and the variation or the dispersion of salary. Then we're going to include team quality metrics and a measure of player ability in the distribution. And then we're going to have team and year dummy variables and other covariates. The other covariates are going to be related to coaching. And we'll have some other variables eventually. So the variables that we're going to use: points, league points per game, natural logarithm. We're going to use the Gini coefficient and its square, but we're also going to use the coefficient of variation and its square. We're going to use, though I'm not going to report on it here, the Gini coefficient for goals, assists, and what I'm calling on target, which basically just means for an individual player, the percentage of their shots that are shots on goal. Then what we're going to do is construct a measure of ability or a measure of contribution to the team performance. And that's going to be similar to what Dave Barry did ages ago. It's going to be similar to what Jerry Scully did in his 1972 paper. I mean, it's something that's been around a while. And then you see the other control variables there. National team players, notice it says not yet because we haven't collected all of them yet. Designated players, not yet because we haven't collected them all. And we have some of the coaching variables, but not all of them just yet. Okay, so how are we going to construct abilities? Basically, what I'm going to do is estimate a model that has team log points per game as the dependent variable. And I'm going to use as explanatory variables inputs into the production of the output. And my first feeling about it was that those inputs should not include goals and should not include assists. And my intuition on that is that a goal is as much an output as it is an input. And on a practical matter, including goals wipes out everything else basically. Not entirely, but pretty close. So the basic idea was to use the save percentage. So the number of shots a goalkeeper faced relative to the number that they saved, the number of shutouts, the number of fouls committed by the team, the number of fouls suffered by the team, the share of the shots taken by the team that were on target, the number of penalty kicks that the goalkeeper faced, not the number that they let score, but the number that they faced, and goals scored, and team fixed effects. Now, there's other variables that we could have used in there, like we could have used red cards and yellow cards, which was something I wanted to do. Unfortunately, while we can find out red cards and yellow cards for individual players, we have to aggregate it up and haven't quite gotten the aggregation to match. We're just not sure yet that we're getting all of them correctly attributed to a particular team in a particular season. So rather than introduce that bias into or measurement error into the analysis, it's not included. Another variable that wanted to use is corner kicks. Unfortunately, we could know how many corner kicks a team took, but we don't know how many corner kicks any particular player took. So there's other things we'd like to use, but so far haven't been able to. So we're going to estimate this relationship. We're going to use the coefficients on those variables to predict the log points per game of the individual players. So we're going to take those team-related coefficients to the individual player data, interact them, produce a prediction of what that player contributed to the team points, and then construct a Gini coefficient out of that by each team and season. So my apologies for using a Stata output instead of making a nice table, but since I was running this regression, or all of these regressions actually last night, that's the best I could do in the time I had. So what do you see here? The log of the points per game is significantly influenced by the save percentage and the number of shutouts and the number of on-target shots, and ultimately by the number of goals scored. If I take that goals scored out of there, the penalty kick PKA4, which is the number of penalty kicks that the goalkeeper faced, would also become significant. So I take those coefficients that you see there and go to the individual data from this team level data to produce predictions of the log points per player and we take the anti-log of that, because one thing we discovered in this process is if you try to take the Gini of negative numbers, you get garbage. So we had to take the log points to get some meaningful numbers. And here's the distribution of what those Ginis look like. So on the left, you see if you produce the Gini omitting goals from that previous regression, and on the right, you have what happens, what those Ginis look like if you include goals. Now, why do you have that really low portion? It's basically because goalkeepers are going to contribute 0 goals. So once you put goals in, you're going to naturally change the distribution a little bit of the individual production. So now we've got these Gini coefficients. We're going to go back to the team level data, which I haven't really described, but we have 242 observations. Actually, for those that earlier regression, we had more than that. 242 observations. The reason we had more is because we could also use 2005 and 2006. We can't use those earlier years here because we don't have variables that we need for those 2 years. So we have all of the teams, 25 teams in Major League Soccer. 9 teams were in the league for the entire period. There have been 15 expansion teams, including 2 that just began play in 2020. And those 2, if I can ask you to pardon my French, are a gigantic pain in the ass. And the reason that is because when we scraped the data for the most recent years, that any player that was on a team in 2020 was listed to be with that team every year of their career. How that happened, I don't know. So we had a big cleanup process to go back and attribute players to their actual team, not to the team they were playing on for the 2 games of this season before they shut down. I say there's 15 expansion teams. You with +2 for the 2020 entrance. You can also think about San Jose and Houston in a different way, because there was a team in San Jose, California. It moved to Houston. The entire franchise just moved to Houston, and then 2 years later, they put a new franchise in San Jose. So whether you think of the San Jose franchise as an expansion franchise or a continuation, and the Houston franchise as a new one, we've treated them as existing franchises as opposed to expansion. I don't believe it's going to make any difference. So here's some descriptive statistics. Log points per game. You see there, we have the 242 observations. We're going to use the coefficient of variation and the Gini for the base salary. The base salary, and we have for both the base and their total salary. The difference is the base salary is what they're going to get paid independent of any sort of bonus money for particularly highly productive seasons or whatever. So this is going into the season really what their salary is expected to be. Doesn't change much in the little bit that I've checked if we use total salary instead. But if we use total salary, then we have a little bit to worry about with a little bit more to worry about with respect to potential endogeneity. So we've got the Gini coefficient for the productivity that I just showed you, both with and without goals. We have a dummy variable if the head coach is a foreigner, is a non-American. We have a dummy variable for whether they're a foreign player or not, former player or not, in Major League Soccer or elsewhere at the professional level. We also have the number of years of playing experience, but I didn't put it in this slide. What I haven't talked about really is relative wage base. So again, base just means we're using the base salary. Relative wage means we take the total salary for this club in this season relative to the average salary in the league that season. So you can see obviously that the mean of that is going to be 0, and you can see what the range is. Some clubs' salary was 3.6 times what the average was. So considering this is a team with a quote unquote salary cap, that's a pretty remarkable figure. Here's what the salary distributions look like in terms of the Gini, both on the base, the Gini on the base and the coefficient of variation on the base. You see that generally speaking, the structures look the same between the two. And that's going to turn out to be pretty interesting for the results that we see, or actually that I'll tell you about, but I won't necessarily show you. So just some correlations here to get an idea about what might be going on. So the coefficient of variation in goals and our productivity measure actually is negatively correlated. So the distribution of productivity measured two different ways are negatively correlated. That suggests to me that there's more to productivity than just goals, which, since what we saw was significance of save percentage and shutouts, that's not surprising. Productivity is positively correlated with the Gini coefficient on the base salary, the coefficient of variation on the base salary, and the relative wage. So those are things that we might not be surprised to see. So here's the first regression result. And again, I apologize for what this looks like. So what I've done here is just estimated the model without any measure of productivity. And you see there that the relative wage is basically hump shaped. So as the wage increases of this club relative to the average, their productivity or their output in terms of points per game goes up, but it reaches a maximum and then declines after that. And for the base salary coefficient of variation, you get the opposite sort of result, that it's downward sloping to begin with, reaches a minimum, and then starts to rise. Now, this result is very similar to, well, it's identical in quality, but not identical quantitatively to what Bernd and Todd Jewell and I found in our paper from 4 or 5 years ago. It's similar to what Anna and I found in our paper that's in Contemporary Economic Policy now, published in January. But that's not surprising because all we've done here, in effect, is use 2 more years worth of data. And so it's saying that those 2 years of data didn't radically affect what the results would look like. And then we see that teams that are in their first season, meaning their expansion teams, perform worse than other teams. So I could have produced the salary, the marginal effect of the relative wage, but I've just produced it here for the coefficient of variation on the base salary. And what you see is that the marginal effect is negative, but getting smaller, or closer to 0 rather, and turns to be 0 around, that works out to be around 0.12. So the range on the coefficient of variation is from 0.06 roughly to about 0.18. And so basically what I've got there is changing it by 0.02 at a step. And it's changing to 0 around 0.12, roughly speaking. But it's negative and then becomes insignificantly different from 0. Now what I'm going to do is the reverse. I'm going to include the Gini coefficient on the productivity with the goals. And you see an interesting thing here is this Gini coefficient on the productivity of goals significant at the 10% level, on its level, really close to the 10% level on the quadratic term, and jointly different from 0 with a p-value of about 0.8. But interestingly, relative wage is no longer individually significant either at the level or the quadratic term. Compare that, I'm going to go back here a second, compare that to in this circumstance, how much different that is. That suggests that this variation in the salary is pretty significant, as it's very much changed. Its omission has very much changed the relationship for relative wage. Let's see. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is put both of them in there at the same time. And what we see is that the coefficient of variation effects seem much more like they did in the situation without the productivity dispersion. Relative wage, very much like it was without the productivity dispersion. And the productivity dispersion is, again, not individually significant except at the 10% level for its for the level value and the quadratic value, not quite significant even at the 10% level, but jointly statistically significant. And I think the p-value here is 0.06 on that joint hypothesis. So what do I make of that? It does seem that these dispersions are not really measuring the same thing. If they were measuring the same thing, we shouldn't find that the Gini on productivity was significant. It would just be swamped by, or all of its influence be captured by, the salary dispersion. Omission then biases our results, though what we saw was not by very much. So what I'm going to show you now is the marginal effects of all of this. So here it is with respect to the Gini of the productivity, and we see that the more dispersed is the productivity, the higher is the team performance, but that the impact is getting smaller. So we have a hill shape here. It's getting smaller. And if the dispersion gets too high, if the discrepancy between the high productivity players and the low productivity players gets too big, then it turns negative. And this is really that talent management story. You don't want to have a couple of superstars and then a bunch of scrubs. You want to have a much more similar, to some extent, degree of ability amongst your players than that a couple of superstars and then not such good players to pair with them. What we have here is the marginal effect of the relative wage bill, and again we see increasing the farther the bigger your wage bill is relative to the average, you are performing better. That marginal impact is getting smaller, and it turns down or hits 0 right around twice the average salary. So I think that if you recall, the maximum of that relative wage base was 3.5 or 3.6 or something. So this biggest number here is 4 times as big. And so right here in the middle, around twice as big, is pretty much maximizing the benefit that you can get. So increasing your wage bill more than twice of what the average is in the league is not beneficial. Then we come to the salary dispersion's marginal effect. And one thing I need to do is put these side by side with the earlier ones. There's a little bit of difference numerically, but in terms of statistical significance, qualitative implications, they're basically the same, that this dispersion is harming the club up until a point, and then beyond that, it basically has no effect, at least no effect within inside the relevant range. So if I made that far bigger than any of the actual coefficients of variation in the data, and you can see that the z-scores are rising, could potentially make it positive and statistically significant, but within the data, it's either negative or zero. So what do we have? Salary and abilities dispersion represent different influences, and if you introduce abilities, it doesn't lead to salary insignificance. Salary dispersion negatively influences team results, which is consistent with what Bernd and Todd and I and Anna and I have gotten before for Major League Soccer. Not surprising. Individually direct metrics of different abilities are insignificant. So that's a result that I didn't show you, but if I had just the coefficient of variation or the Gini coefficient on goals or the Gini coefficient on assists, those are not statistically significant. And greater dispersion in the abilities index positively influences team outcomes, at least up to a point. Finally, what are we going to do in the future? I'd like to get alternative metrics of player abilities. So as I was doing this late yesterday, I thought, we should have the coefficient of variation on individual points production, but I don't have the time to produce it. So that would be a nice thing. Where we had actually started with all of this is with the video game ratings. And Petr had collected this data that was used by EA Sports, I think, to produce their FIFA video game. And it's crowdsourced, gives us indications of how people rate each player on their speed, their agility, their ability to pass, their ability to control the ball, dribbling with both feet, many different kinds. I think there's like 140 different metrics in that data. I'd like to do that. That was sort of the original idea. Unfortunately, there aren't enough players in Major League Soccer who have been evaluated on that in the video game context for us to really do anything. Similar to what Egon and Stefan did in their paper, might be possible to use the number of crosses or passes, dribbles, and runs that they use. They call them cooperative and individual play kind of activities. So maybe do something with that. And then Daniel Weimar and Pam Vicker have this paper that uses the distance run by players in a match and the number of intensive runs, meaning sprints of a particular speed. If we could use something like that as a measure of ability or talent or contribution, that would be, I think, an interesting additional approach. We can also think about alternative specification of team production. It doesn't have to be wins. It could be revenue if we could get such information on revenues of the clubs. And then the last one that I was thinking about is goal differential. We have goal differential, and that would be a relatively straightforward thing to do. Just haven't done it yet. So thank you for your attention, and we look forward to comments, suggestions, and your derisive giggling at the stupidity of this project.
Thank you, Dennis. Definitely not bored to tears. Certainly activities anything to go by. So the first thing that I think we'll do in terms of is I'll just run through essentially what various things came up during the chat.
Okay.
Some of them are kind of clarification questions and so on, and then we can open it up to others who are interested to make contributions. So the first question that you might know something about is whether anybody has done this in cricket, particularly T20 cricket, like the IPL, for example. I don't know if you've got any knowledge of papers that have been written in that area.
I don't think anybody's done it in cricket. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that the number of cricket papers I can count on one hand that I've actually seen. I've had 2 or 3 submitted to the Journal of Sports Economics, but I haven't seen many others, and I have encouraged people to do so. So whoever asked the question, have a go at it and think about submitting it to the JSE.
It was Carl, and Carl, Sarah, and myself.
Okay.
Just finished writing a chapter on cricket, so
Okay.
we'll work on something and maybe submit later in the year. Moving on, Alex asks, just as a check, in MLS, it's 3 points for a win, 1 for a draw, 0 for a loss. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Then Carl asks again, is it possible for you to use match-by-match data? Is that what you're doing, or you're upgrading to the season?
No, this is season-long data.
Okay.
I don't know that we would have it. Yeah, I don't know if we would have match by match. Certainly, we wouldn't have salary distribution match by match, right? And
okay, wouldn't that be fixed for a whole season?
Yeah,
or?
exactly.
Okay, yeah. Then Brad commented on your copy and paste job and said you could at least use a monospace font. Moving swiftly on, though, Carl then asked you, in terms of when you were thinking about alternative measures of player, I guess, ability and so on, there's an Audi player index with MLS apparently. I don't know how many years back it goes, but that might be something that you could use in terms of alternative measures.
What's it called again?
The Audi player index. So Audi is in the car maker.
Yeah, I've never heard of that. So yeah, I'll have to check into that.
And then Carl asked why the base salary versus the guaranteed salary in your model specification.
That's a good question for which I have no answer. My gut tells me that what we collected, as I recall looking at the PDFs, was it had base and total, but it didn't have guaranteed. But I could be wrong. It could be that it's been different over different years, and I just don't have a good answer for that. I'm sorry.
Okay. And Jamin says, I'm struggling to interpret salary dispersion once controlling for ability dispersion. Might a lower salary dispersion controlling for ability dispersion just mean that the team found a good bargain on a great player or overpaid on a bad player? In other words, is this really about salary structure for a team production, or is it about spotting and paying talent efficiently?
That's an interesting point. I'm going to say that I think that they're probably observationally equivalent, and we couldn't distinguish between the two. But I haven't really thought about it that way.
Carl's done some work on that as well, and he says that using an AKM model, he found that some team wage premiums are negatively correlated with success in MLS, so evidence towards the idea that teams overpay.
Mm-hmm.
Then how much so go on, Dennis.
Is that paper published somewhere? I don't remember seeing it.
Carl,
it's R&R at International Journal of Sport Finance.
Could you send me a draft?
Yep, will do.
Thank you.
Just carrying on the run through the comments. Jamin says, how much of the salary dispersion is driven by foreign players, 40-year-old European players being paid loads of dollars?
Yeah, one of the issues is that we haven't addressed yet is the designated player, and I think that when we include those, it will address it'll address that issue. When Anna and I for sure included the designated players for our time period ending in 2017, or we included a variable for the number of designated players. It doesn't change the relationship for the salary dispersion. It's downward sloping. More dispersion is harmful up to a point. I'm not sure. I think that's true also in our paper, Bernd and Todd and I.
Okay. And then also, I got a comment is that if foreign players drive attendance and jersey sales, it could be rational to overpay them.
Yeah, I'm never convinced that it's rational to overpay somebody. It's just that we haven't paid them. We haven't accounted correctly for what they're producing.
Yeah, true. That's basically through to the end of the comments. Carl's chipped in with his paper. There's a link to the paper, working paper version in the chat as well. At this point, I'm happy to essentially open this up to anyone else that wants to ask questions. Stefan struggles, isn't able to use the chat, so he might chip in with a question vocally.
Rob here, I can't get on the chat thing either. Your alternative measures of productivity, the whoscored.com has a huge array of possible variables outside of goals and assists. So you could maybe capture midfielders and defenders a bit more.
Okay, great. Thanks, Rob.
And it's got Major League Soccer going some way back. It's archived.
Thank you, Rob.
A couple more things have come in. Georgios Nalbantis says player injuries affect performance of teams and have no impact on salary variance. This can bias the findings. 40-year Europeans are more likely to be injured and also well paid.
I'm thinking about how to respond, and I don't have a response, so I'll just take that as a comment that we need to think about. Thanks, Georgios.
And then also Julio Fuento del Cuervo asks, I guess that for the variance computations, you used all players in the roster. What about using 16 to 18 players instead of all of them? I guess limiting your sample, trimming the mean or something.
Yeah, we could certainly do that. My hunch is that that's going to narrow the Gini substantially, because one of the things I noticed while I had to fix the data issue that I mentioned was that there were numerous players that had 0 lines on everything. So to the extent that they're in the data, they haven't contributed anything, haven't played at all, and so on, then they're bringing down the distribution.
Yeah. Anyone else want to make a contribution? Feel free to unmute yourself and have ask your question or make a comment.
Oh, may I ask?
Yes.
So I'm sorry, it's very in the midnight around, it's around 11 in the night. So I'm from Japan. I'm Pramod. So what I meant to say that it's kind of in especially I'm working on IPL, and especially in the IPL, the salary distribution is kind of it's kind of random, it's determined on the auction, right? But what I mean to what I am looking at is that it's kind of whether the foreign player, because the supply of foreign player is very high and the supply of Indian player is very low, so that might mean the salary dispersion might be different between the Indian and foreign players. So how do you feel that?
Yeah, it's very possible that's true. That's similar to the earlier question about the foreign players in Major League Soccer. A lot of them, well, I shouldn't say that. There's a good chance that high-paid foreign players that are designated players are substantially skewing the salary distribution. And one of the things that I'm thinking about we ought to try or ought to check is whether the results are robust to omitting the designated players from the Gini calculations. So we know that they're causing a problem. In fact, the biggest Gini coefficients in our data happen to come from Los Angeles Galaxy, the first team to hire a designated player in the person of David Beckham, but they were a club that had essentially 2 designated players when nobody else had any, because Landon Donovan was sort of grandfathered in as higher than being paid more than the salary cap allowed. One of the New York clubs, there's a couple of others that have pretty high Gini coefficients and have taken strong advantage of the designated player. And there's some clubs that have effectively not used it at all. So it's very possible that that's happening. On the other hand, there's a lot of players in Major League Soccer that are from Mexico, Peru, Latin America, who play in the U.S. And are not designated players, so they're getting the same kind of pay as the typical American player in the league. But I think it's a good idea to think about that.
Yes, thank you so much. I'm working on these kind of things, so that's why I just asked the questions.
Well,
thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Yes.
Thank you. Any more questions or comments? Okay, well, in the interests of, I guess, drawing a line under things, thank you very much, Dennis. Entertaining study and also, well, entertaining presentation and very interesting study. Lots of comments coming in. Thank you very much. In the midst of that talk, Frank sent me a picture of the awarding for Petr of the Larry Hadley Award. If you can see, there's it's from 2 years ago. Oops, sorry. And Brad Humphries and Dennis Coates awarding Placido Rodriguez the Larry Hadley Award from the North American Association of Sports Economists. So that's a recognition of the formative role that that conference has played in developing the field as we know it. And then just to draw things to a close, to advertise next week's session. We'll be back in a week's time, and we'll be on football again, or soccer, and we'll be looking with Jorge Tovar of the University of Wisconsin, emotions and performance, a quasi-natural experiment from the FIFA World Cup. Really looking forward to welcoming you all back again next week. I hope you enjoy your weekend and stay safe. All the best. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, James.
Thanks, Dennis.